I think what's interesting about family is that family is both about being thrown into a dynamic with people you may not have actually ever chosen to be friends with if you were given a choice, right? But it's also about power, which I think is really interesting because inherently a family has a power dynamic, right? Like parents have power over their children. They just do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of that's about giving your children ethics, morality, support, comfort, safety. It's about helping them to be the person they've always wanted to be. It's like that, the Khalil Gibran poem, the one that's like, your children are not your children, they are arrows that fly from the bow that is you, etc. And all, that was a very terrible paraphrase, but the idea that, you can use that power for good, but you can also use it for evil. So those power dynamics can be very messy and really, well, frankly, fuck people up, right? So I think that is really interesting. But when you take that into like a fantastical context, like the Targaryens, so I'm going to stick with this, it becomes about power in terms of rule, leadership. Who gets to be the head of a family? Who gets to choose who marries whom? Who gets to decide who runs a country? How do you keep power within a family? What happens when new people join a family? Who is valued more, the sons or the daughters, the direct heir or the cousin or the brother, right? Or in the Targaryens, potentially both, I suppose.
All of the above.
Yeah. Hey, Targaryens, they're open to whatever works best.
Yeah, it's very Habsburg, right? It's not really a family line so much as a circle. But
it's like an Ouroboros of incest.
Yes. How have we ended up here? This is my fault.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 129 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me, as always, my co-host, the Chewie to my Han Solo, the Joker to my Commander Shepard, MJ Kuhn. How's it going, MJ?
Hello. I am doing lovely. How are you?
Doing lovely, too. And you know what's also lovely are MJ's books. You got Among Thieves and the sequel, Thick-Ass Thieves. It's a little bit thicker than Among Thieves, so it does have a thicker ass. But if you want a complete duology, full of, we're going to continue the mischief theme this week, full of a mischievous found family and hatchets and lots of killing and lots of swearing, but really fun stuff. It's very lighthearted at the same time. Go get it. MJ's books.
Lighthearted murder.
Lighthearted murder. Help her quit that fucking day job, people.
Excellent. And if you want to support Adrian and read a wonderful police procedural, mushroom, fungal punk, wonderful, psychedelic fueled adventure,
wonderful,
check out Mushroom Blues. Yeah, here we go. Crushed it.
All right. And don't forget that we have a Patreon. So if you want to support the show, go head over there and give us a little kickback and support what we do here. We're very thankful to everyone who supports us on the Patreon. Also subscribe on your favorite podcast app and check out the show and video on the FanFiAddict YouTube channel. And now joining us once again is Tasha Suri, author of the books of Amba Duology, the Burning Kingdom trilogy, which starts with this one, Jasmine Throne, and this beautiful green one, the Oleander Sword, and book 3, The Lotus Empire, which is out now. So go support Tasha and what she does. Welcome back. How are you doing, Tasha?
I'm doing really good. I also realized I probably should have grabbed a copy of the last book.
I got them for you, yeah.
Yeah,
the cover's red, and it's
sexy. The cover is red, and it has 2 women on it instead of 1, so you'll know it's a third. That's the tell, yeah.
The sapphic triumvirate is finally... Well, a heads up, this is part 2 of our 2-part chat with Tasha, so I recommend checking out part 1 to get to know her better. Today, though, we're having a reunion. A family reunion as we talk about fictional family dynamics. So to kick off this masterclass, I want to ask you, Tasha, what does family mean to you? Especially, as someone who was born and raised in the UK, but with South Asian heritage. So kind of like you have a bit of perspective in both worlds. And especially for me, like growing up in Canada and then coming to Ecuador, I'm like, wow, families means a different thing here. So
So yeah, family is a big thing. Family's a big thing. So my family are mostly Punjabi and came as immigrants in, I think my mum must have come in the 60s. My dad came in the 80s. And I think family means family both means family and community, I think, when you're part of a diaspora community, right? Like you have the kind of the nuclear heterosexual family, the mother, the father, but you also have, grandparents. But I have a lot of, and it took me a while to realize this was unusual. I had a lot of aunts and uncles and Marcies and Massers, and which is your mother's sisters, for example, and your mother's brothers, and who are them, your mamas, who were not related to me by blood. And I didn't realize that that was unusual. But I think what I find quite touching is that when my grandparents came to England, they made friends with other people who became family to them because they were so alone, and I think that kind of community became very important to them. And I grew up with people who I think of as, my cousin sisters and cousin brothers who are not related to me. And that's also a funny term, right? Like that your cousins are your siblings in so many ways. And as an only child, that's quite nice for me. So even today, one of my cousin sisters lives really near to me. I'm very involved in her life. She's very involved in mine. Family come and stay a lot. What your family think of you and how you relate to and show your love and your care for your family to your larger extended family are really important. So family is community as well as family, I suppose. And that's really nice. It can sometimes also be less nice, I think, depending on what you do and don't want people to know, who's in your business, whether you have to show love or fealty to people that you don't necessarily want to. And the other kind of fun thing about family, and I genuinely mean this, is how it's universal to all families. All families have beef that goes back generations. There is no family that hasn't had an argument that has spanned multiple lives and has grown out of proportion. And I love that. I think that's beautiful.
I agree. Families are fucking messy.
Yes.
And beautiful at the same time.
I love it. Well, so is that messiness part of why family dynamics are so much fun in fiction, do you think? Like, and also kind of building on that, do you have some favorite examples of like family dynamics from books, TV, films that kind of...
Oh, I'm going to get
incorporate
cancelled
that?
because the first thing that came to my head was the Targaryens. I don't know why my brain did that. I don't even think it's my favorite example, but it just came to me
When we
immediately.
think family in the modern age, we think incest, evidently.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
All right, we're 5 minutes in. We've already hit that note. We got this.
No.
You're welcome, everybody.
Oh, my God.
All right, incest aside, we'll put incest in its box. We'll go over there.
Yeah, we'll package it up nicely and just
Yeah. That can go in the corner. Yes.
I think what's interesting about family is that family is both about being thrown into a dynamic with people you may not have actually ever chosen to be friends with if you were given a choice, right? But it's also about power, which I think is really interesting because inherently a family has a power dynamic, right? Like parents have power over their children. They just do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of that's about giving your children ethics, morality, support, comfort, safety. It's about helping them to be the person they've always wanted to be. It's like that, the Khalil Gibran poem, the one that's like, your children, not your children, they are arrows that fly from the bow that is you, etc. And all, that was a very terrible paraphrase, but the idea that, you can use that power for good, but you can also use it for evil. So those power dynamics can be very messy and really, well, frankly, fuck people up, right? So I think that is really interesting. But when you take that into like a fantastical context, like the Targaryens, so I'm going to stick with this, it becomes about power in terms of rule, leadership. Who gets to be the head of a family? Who gets to choose who marries whom? Who gets to decide who runs a country? How do you keep power within a family? What happens when new people join a family? Who is valued more, the sons or the daughters, the direct heir or the cousin or the brother, right? Or in the Targaryens, potentially both, I suppose.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Hey, Targaryens, they're open to whatever works best.
Yeah, it's very Habsburg, right? It's not really a family line so much as a circle. But
it's like an Ouroboros of incest.
Yes. How have we ended up here? This is my fault. So I'm going to veer back to safe territory and say it's the power dynamics that are really fascinating and the way that you can extrapolate them in a fantastical setting to be as messy as possible for as many people.
Yeah. And last episode, you touched on it a little bit with the influences that you had around the Burning Kingdoms and drawing inspiration from specifically this really
The Mughal dynasty.
like Mughal dynasty, and how these sort of like political familial dynamics between these heirs to the throne, and how doesn't necessarily mean you're the oldest brother, therefore you are the heir. That just becomes a hot mess real fast. So when it comes to your own work, do you want to elaborate a little bit on the roles that families play, and sort of like why family dynamics became something that you chose to incorporate into your stories?
Oh yeah, of course. So speaking of like the Mughal dynasty, or any kind of inherited leadership like the Ottomans, or even like the European monarchies, what's really interesting is they are very much about keeping it in the family, right? They want familial inheritance. They want the family line to continue to rule. But every approach is a mess, because you can't really control reproduction in that way. So, you look at like the Tudors, for example, and the mess that happened there with 7 wives, was it 6 wives? God, I'm really bad at numbers. It's 6 wives, isn't it?
And it's 6 and 7. That's the hang up all time today.
Yeah, no, I'm really bad at numbers.
I just looked it up. It's 6 wives. Don't you worry.
Thank you. I should know this. I should. Never mind. Divorce, beheaded, die, divorce, beheaded. 6. Yeah. So my point with this is getting, what you want is a male heir. You want the firstborn male heir to rule. That can get messy because children die, and also maybe you don't have a son. What do you do then? So the Ottoman solution to this was to have many different concubines and many sons. And then they all fight and one wins. That's also very messy for obvious reasons. So the Mughal approach was there were many wives again, and there were many sons. And then they just sort of waited to see how it would work out broadly, which often meant that there was a lot of war and spats, and it wasn't an expectation that you would kill all your siblings, because often they really loved each other. But it was messy. It was messy, and there would be a lot of conflict until somebody succeeded in winning the throne. And I think that's always interesting to me, because that's just real. You can imagine how real that is. Real people and the dynamics between family members. And then you place something like monarchy or leadership and power onto that. Oof, very messy. And I find that really fascinating. So in the context of the Burning Kingdoms, I found one particular, I called it a spat in the last episode, so I'll keep that up. One particular spat for the throne, really interesting, between Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh particularly. There were other brothers in play, but these 2 were the main ones that we need to think about. One brother who is now remembered as a zealot, though he actually, if you read about him, had some... He was a more complex figure than he's often portrayed, I think it's fair to say. I've forgotten the name of the historian who wrote about him, so I will just shut up and leave it there. But there was, with the other brother, Dara Shikoh is largely remembered as being a poet and a mystic, and as somebody who was very religious in a very different way, and much more into syncretism and the idea of mixing of religions. Wasn't a very good leader, though, I think, by any standards, so he didn't win. And two of their sisters were very involved in their politics for the throne, and one of them was Jahanara Begum, who I always think would have been a much better leader than either of them even. And I think that inspired a lot of the Burning Kingdoms and my approach to the political battle for the throne in that book between siblings. So I just find the kind of the messy politics of families meeting the messy politics of governance really interesting. And I like to see how those things never go well together and always turn quite explosive. And that I found very inspirational.
And explosive is a very good way of putting it.
Isn't it? Yes.
The kingdoms do indeed burn.
Yes. Right. Spoilers.
Spoilers. It's the name of the series.
Oh my gosh. Well, and then, so is that kind of explosiveness, the conflict? Families are ripe for conflict and all of this. Do you think that conflict is one of the keys to having a successful fictional family dynamic? In some ways, is the key to a successful fictional family dynamic the opposite of the successful actual family dynamic?
Right? Communication. Yes.
Yeah. What are some ways? Yeah. Don't write a happy family. But what are some ways that a family dynamic in a book might fall flat? What are some of your tricks for keeping it interesting?
I think that sometimes, and hilariously, I'm an only child, so we're going to go from there. I think that sometimes people will write very sweet family dynamics, and I've done it too, right? I've done it too, where there's a lot of love and affection and good communication. But I think what that misses about family dynamics is that a family see each other from the beginning, often from the beginning to the end, unless they break apart for any reason. And as a result of that, you share the same shames. You often share great festering hatreds and recriminations. You know, you stole my cardigan when we were 12. I'll never forget it. That was my favorite cardigan. Well, you stole my husband, and so forth. You know, it builds from that.
One of these feels worse than the other.
Right?
Cardigan.
Like, a cardigan that you really like is so hard to find.
You stole my husband while wearing my cardigan.
That's
Now
a different
you're in
level.
for it.
Unforgivable.
Yeah.
The husband you can forgive. Anyway, my point is, I think that you have a lot of like old resentments that play in, and old memories that you share, or old traumas that you share. So there's a lot of baggage that makes a family that isn't pleasant. Unpleasant baggage often drives what binds a family together as much as the good stuff. And I think that a family can fall flat if you don't let them have shared unpleasant baggage or resentment. Because if anything, I think, so to use an example, in the Jasmine Throne, we learn pretty early on, so hopefully it's not a spoiler, that Priya and Bhumika present as maidservant and lady of the house, but are actually essentially sisters, not by blood, but by rearing. And they have a lot of resentment between each other. They, you know, Bhumika is exasperated with Priya for always doing what she wants to do. Priya does not understand how Bhumika can put on this front of being this good little meek wife when that isn't who she is as far as Priya is concerned. So they often clash and don't understand each other. And if anything, those resentments, that shared history, that shared trauma is what makes them sisters more than anything else. Of course, the love and the affection is there too, but it's kind of tangled with all that other stuff really heavily. And they never necessarily fix it or work through it. It's just part of their dynamic that they have to deal with.
Yeah. And building on that dynamic, I think the fact that there are multiple kinds of dynamics when it comes to families, in and of itself provides different kinds of narrative conflict and tension. So it's like you have the tension and conflict between siblings. You know, you stole my cardigan, or you fucked my husband while wearing the cardigan. Or you have the relationships between parents and children, you know, or grandparents and grandchildren, you know, like multi-generational. You have extended family. And then within all of that, you have representations of healthy and dysfunctional families. So how might these different circumstances affect how a family dynamic kind of plays out from like a narrative point of view?
Interesting. So I think what's very important when depicting a family is to think about the pressures that are on that family and how they define that particular family. So, for example, what I think is interesting about Priya's family, because they are essentially a group of children who are burned to death. That's the unfortunate reality, is that we don't necessarily see that much unpleasantness, although we do see some elements of it between the siblings. What's important is the loss there. So that's part of the depiction of the shared trauma of the survivors. Whereas with, I don't know if this is really answering the question, but whereas with Malini and her siblings, what defines them isn't a shared, like, essentially a shared exterior trauma that shaped them, external trauma that shaped them, but it's their complicity, I suppose. I think one of the things that really drives my understanding as the author of that family is a scene where Malini remembers her brother, Chandra, cutting her hair. He basically, and she has a scar on her neck forever because of that. And her mother witnesses this and doesn't stop it. And her other brother doesn't really take it seriously and isn't aware that it took place because there's no point telling him. So it's this shared sense of this dysfunctional dynamic and the way that it festers and it moves within that circle. It's an internal trauma. So I realize I'm defining all these families by an external or an internal trauma, but I do think that when we're writing, often what is really important is to find the vulnerabilities of our characters in order to create story and conflict, right? And
it's like the shared aspect of it, but it's also the ways in which each particular individual within that family dynamic has a different reaction,
response
perception,
to the trauma,
and response to a particular thing. It doesn't even necessarily have to be trauma inflicted upon them. It could be something that they were complicit in and that they did to somebody else, or it could be something that is like imparted upon them from like grandparents to children to grandchildren, for instance. But do you think it's like that shared kind of?
I think it is a shared experience, and I think you've hit the nail on the head with the different responses are so important. You share that, whatever it might be, you know, that shared curse or that shared inheritance, but how you respond to it defines your role within that family. And I think also it's not just your response, but what your response says about your relationship to everybody else in that space. So, you know, what does the silence of the mother say about Marloney's mother? Does it say that she doesn't love Marloney? Maybe. I don't know. You know, does it say that she values her sons more? Does it say that she thinks her son was correct? I think these are interpretations you could have, but for me, it said that she doesn't feel she has the power to speak in this situation. So she has to summon somebody else who has more power in the end in order to stop it. So I think that you can only read those characters in the context of their relationships. So, for example, with Priya, she is very independent and does her own thing, and she's very bolshy with Bhumika. She doesn't want to do what she says. But when she meets Ashok, she kind of folds. She's like, I'll of course do what he wants. In the end, she doesn't for various reasons, but she feels more beholden to him. She feels like she owes him, even though it is Bhumika who protected her, really, in the long term. So I think that what I find really interesting about family dynamics is that you can set them up at the beginning of a book and then put pressure on them and watch how they crack or change or shift, or you can crack them before you enter the book and then see how they cope with those fractures. Because if something, the problem, I guess, or the interesting thing about a fictional, let's say, family dynamic is once you break the trust, it doesn't break necessarily the family connection. So they still have to limp along with distrust or resentment or hope or grief without any way to necessarily resolve it at the start of the story.
I think limp is a good way to put it. It's like the crippling of this dynamic kind of lays a foundation for the potentials for repair or further crippling
or further damage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and sometimes it offers opportunities for, like, if you both shout something that you've been hiding, maybe it offers the opportunity for like real healing or forgiveness. But I think all of that stuff is useful because you can throw it in a book and watch them run. And it feeds into the conflicts that, shape a story. So you can have, let's say hypothetically, 3 siblings trying to find a lost artifact. If you make it so those 3 siblings are doing it because their father told them to, and they all have different relationships with their father, instantly more drama on the page.
Yeah.
Lara Croft's hidden siblings.
Yeah, Lara Croft now with triplets.
There we go, the Croft triplets. Yeah. Well, that kind of leads to something I wanted to talk about, which is how you kind of convey those family dynamics to a reader, because that's that can be challenging, right? We've got a few tools in our arsenal. You got dialogue, you got the internal thoughts, perceptions of other characters of a dynamic, right? What are some of your favorite elements to play with, and how do you use those to kind of convey a complicated dynamic?
Oh, I think you really caught it there. I think you have to use different things to get it across, right? Because I think characters lie to themselves, right? Characters so often lie to themselves. And how I'm sure we've all read or seen characters who go, he really loves me. And we go, no, he doesn't. And sometimes the only way that you can express that is by having other perspectives come in and go, this is how we perceive it versus how this character does. Equally, you can play with the lies that characters tell themselves by showing action. So you can have this character go, he really loves me, and then show what the said he is doing. And we can read as readers that isn't correct and that something is wrong there. So I think you can play with perception through points of view or through action versus point of view very effectively. I think another thing that's really good is to kind of, again, throw characters into situations and watch how they respond. I think you can set up an initial dynamic really well, but it's only as you start putting stress on it that we start to see what they really think and feel and believe. And that's pretty key. So you can introduce 2 sisters who seem to get along perfectly, put pressure on it and introduce the cracks over time. Or you can get them into a story apparently as huge enemies and then bring them closer by putting them under pressure as well. So I think action is really key to me in how you depict this.
Yeah. And then that all kind of feeds into character growth, because like these characters are the core factor in these fictional families. Without these characters, there is nothing there. So how do you approach character growth through this lens of family dynamics? And especially, I think there's a really interesting dynamic with families because there's both individual growth and then there's group growth. And
Yes.
that
Yeah.
group can be comprised of siblings. It can be comprised of an entire family. It can be comprised of multiple generations. It can be comprised of blood siblings versus what you've been talking about like, I would say more cultural and
Mhm.
community driven relationships. So how do you kind of approach character growth in that sense?
So I think when we talk about character growth on an individual level, we talk about, how does a character change is how we describe it, right? Very simply. But I think a key part of that is what is a character's flaw or false belief and how do they overcome it? Or how did they get worse? It's the converse. They just have to shift from A to B, and B can be anything. B can be awful, but B can be great. And it's never like a linear movement. There has to be a push and a pull. I think that is pretty inherent in a lot of books, right? Is a character, I think in the Poppy War, for example, is really a good example of this. You've got a character who is drawn to power, and that power will corrupt them. Are they going to take it? There's never a moment where we go, yeah, she's doing it, go. There's a lot of push and pull, like she's going to do it, she's not, she's going to do it, she's not, until she makes a decision. So I think that also applies to family dynamics. What is in that dynamic that they either need to overcome or is going to get significantly worse? So are they, a parent and a child where the child needs to embrace their own desires and beliefs and take independence from their parents, or are you going to take them on a journey where the child who we think could have become better than their parent ends up taking on their parents' belief because they desperately want that love and become much worse and become indoctrinated to that particular parent's viewpoint, hypothetically? That's a journey either way. That they go on, and seeing that push and pull is what makes it interesting. So I think that it's in that case, it's kind of a dual character growth, and it's an interconnected growth or regression, I suppose. When we're talking about like the dynamic of a larger group, I think that still applies because you can think about the problem that the larger group has, or the thing that they need to fix or need to explore together. But that can be more complicated because you have more characters to handle, right? And I think sometimes when you're handling each character individually and thinking about their journey of growth, that happens almost organically as they each change and interact with each other and grow. But sometimes if you're dealing with a large enough group, you need to pick one character who defines the change. So in the Lotus Empire, which no one's read yet, so never mind, there's a group of children, and I can't really look at the growth of every single child because that would be really difficult. So I focus on, I think, one child in particular and his journey of growth and his change as a result of being part of a community of children who are essentially his family. And that defines the change of the group because we see them altering and shifting through the lens of his experience.
I like that. It helps to kind of lessen the anxiety as an author to think like, how am I going to manage all of this? Because it's like, not only may you have a multiple POV book, but then one of those POVs, I think having them represent a larger group makes it seem less daunting.
Oh yeah, 100%.
And anything we can do to make writing seem less daunting is a bonus. It's a very good thing.
I'm a big fan of breaking things down to their component parts and just focusing, right? This is also advice that I had when I had to write battles in the Oleander Sword, and I was like, I don't know if I can write battles. What am I doing? So I asked for some advice, and I was told, instead of thinking about the battle as a whole, of course you have to describe the sweeping movement of large, cavalry, infantry, etc. That's important. Think about the individuals within that battle that are important to the reader because they will represent everyone else. So of course we want to, see the army move, but it's individuals that shape our overall experience of what's going on. And I think that applies to a family as well. I really do.
And not only that, but families are shaped by external forces as well. So
Right.
just like a battle is being shaped by both individuals and larger forces. It's like families are shaped by history, by expectations, by roles, traumas, deeds in the past, or
Right.
deeds in the
Yeah.
present, whether good or bad. But also on top of that, like the culture that surrounds them. So
Right. Exactly.
how do you approach the ways that characters react to some of these bigger forces that are kind of like outside of their families,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
how how a family could reflect upon the culture that they inhabit?
I see what you mean. I think what I'll start with is saying that probably the easiest thing you can do, or the thing I would advise to do, since we're doing a masterclass, is make the family in some way integral to the shifting change in the culture. So they're not beholden to it, they're not victim to it exactly. Although I don't quite mean victim, because I think the more agency you can give your characters, the better. So, um, Marloney's family are beholden to, well, they are part of the change of who gets to rule. So they aren't so much beholden to and suffering from that change as they are making themselves suffer by doing what they're doing, right? Not so for Priya's family, but at the same time, they're integral to that sea change in who rules Ahiranya, which is where they're from. They are integral to that because of what happens to them that is done to them, essentially, well, this is a spoiler, by their own parent figures, their parental figures. So it's somewhat of an internal and external conflict in the family or change in the family. And so the internal changes of both of those families affect everything. And so that can be quite useful because then you don't have to worry about exactly how outside forces are going to shape them, and their integrality, is that how you say that? Makes them more important to the plot and makes them feel more relevant to the plot. That said, I think what is really interesting about placing a family under stresses that are external to them is exploring how their connections to each other change their response. So I'm going to talk about the Oleander Sword, which has Bhumika in a situation where she has a small child, and something happens, and it puts a lot of stress on her relationship with her own baby because suddenly her child is potentially in danger if she doesn't comply and act in certain ways. So instantly, the behavior she would have used in book one in order to achieve and accomplish things is not something she can use in book two. And so that becomes interesting because I was going to say because she's an interesting character, but because it puts her in an interesting situation which we can empathize with. So I think another thing to consider with families, and I don't know if this answers the question, is that inherently we as readers have certain feelings about families, whether they are traditional or non-traditional. If we see an adult loving a child, we care about that child and about that adult, and we will be very sad if things happen to either of them. And so as authors, as writers, we can use that peril or that fear to our benefit. I'm not saying kill babies, but I'm saying the
Speaking of
fear
the
of,
Poppy War,
oh God,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh my God, that book messed me up. I remember reading, I can't remember which chapter it was, the chapter in the Poppy War, while I was on a bus and just going, this is a terrible place to be reading this chapter. I'm having so many emotions. But I think it's partly like putting stress on a family dynamic makes us empathize because we inherently care about certain dynamics. Siblings, children, parents, grandparents, we care generally. But it's also interesting because of the ways it changes the behavior of the characters within that family. But my general advice would be place that family at the center of sea changes so that they are both the cause and the sufferers, because that can be really interesting to engage with.
Tension.
yeah,
Tension.
the cause of their own suffering.
Yeah.
Well, to return to incest, no, I'm just kidding. And
Speaking
I
of
do want to
tension,
talk.
You're going to get me cancelled. It's nothing for you.
I do want to talk about romance, but it's just funny to think of it as in an episode of family. But a romantic partnership is often the foundation of a new family, unit, right? So if we're talking about romance, how can romantic relationships reflect the family dynamic? I think of of each party in the romance, and then what steps do you take to kind of meld those family dynamics together to create this whole new dynamic in the partnership?
See, that's really interesting. I really love that question because I think, often we don't talk about the ways that families come together when people end up in a long-term partnership and how messy that is, right? When different families have different expectations. So I think what I'll touch on briefly is that Bhumika is the best example of a hetero, patriarchal marriage in the book. So she marries her husband, and he is from the colonizing city-state, and she is from the colonized. But she is married because she is a noble woman. She's highborn. She's beautiful. She's, a good connection to the area. He feels like he's doing something good, marrying a much younger, beautiful lady who is a native, so to speak, quote unquote. And I think that she has to essentially give up a lot of what makes her who she is. She becomes a cipher. She is what he wants her to be. She is his helpmeet and his support. And therefore that's how the families meet, by raising one in order to replace it with another. And I'm not saying that's what marriage or having children is at all, but I think that's kind of the worst version of families uniting, right? In a kind of heteropatriarchal model. And yeah, I think there are other examples where family doesn't work like that at all, right? Where two families meet and they're complicated and messy. I don't think you necessarily see that in the Burning Kingdoms as much, because there's so much death and nobody's marrying particularly well. And marriage is always about power in the book, particularly. But I think that dynamic can be really interesting, the culture clashes you can have between the internal cultures of two families and the ways they interact. I was actually watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine earlier today.
Such a good show.
Love that
I know.
show.
And, so their parents met in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, like Amy, and and it was so funny because like the cultural dynamic of each family, like, and I don't mean culture as in Cuban versus white, but like the internal cultures were different. And the ways that they kind of clashed or engaged was really fun to watch, and I thought very realistic.
I mean, I've lived that in real time, just like.
Oh, right, you have, haven't you?
I married into an Ecuadorian family, so it's like my Canadian family and her Ecuadorian family mixing. I mean, Tasha, you too, like you.
Yeah, I have, actually, yeah.
With your marriage, it's like this interesting. It's like the best metaphor I can make for it is like when you see a river meet the ocean, and you have a river with all of its silt and all of its detritus that is kind of like flowing out into the ocean. And if you see it from above, like on Google Maps or in like an aerial footage or something like that, you see like the blue gray of the ocean, and then this like crazy intermingling of like silty river and just the two smashing together. And that feels like intercultural marriage.
That's exactly what it is. And there's always two people standing in the corner, generally the people who just got married, going, please don't fight. Just
everyone be cool. Be cool.
Oh, mom, pretend this is fine, etc. Yeah. That's so true. That's so true. I think within the context of the Burning Kingdoms, I think what's interesting is that you can have, or not just in the context of the Burning Kingdoms, but beyond that, is that you can have romantic relationships that kind of don't fit that perfect paradigm, right? Like, for example, sometimes I'll get comments saying, I hope Marlon and Priya get married. And I'm like, they've exchanged garlands. That's the best I can do, my guys. Like, they live in this patriarchal culture. And also, I don't necessarily think that they think of marriage the way we think of marriage, right? There is romantic marriage, but at least in Marlon's mind, marriage is a lot about power and politics. She talks about, I wish you could be my wife, but she's aware that isn't a possibility for her. So I think what's really interesting is that you have this model of a family that's very strict, this kind of male, female, children model. And what I find a lot in the work I write is that often you end up with very different models running around, right? You have children in large groups stuck with one very confused adult, by and large. Maybe that's been my experience. Or you find, you have people who become family to one another. Like, I would say that in book 2 of the series, Gunham and Priya begin to build that kind of bond, and that grows in the Lotus Empire. So I think non-traditional family dynamics are pretty important and pretty fun to play with too, and they're kind of inherent to exploring queer relationships. Doesn't really answer the question about romance, but I think nonetheless.
No, but
it totally does, though.
Because I feel that there are so many long-held expectations of romance, not just in fiction, but in real life.
Yeah.
The expectations that our cultures and our families bring with them about like, what does romance mean? What do relationships mean? What does marriage mean? Yeah. And I think the coolest thing about fantasy and science fiction is that there's so much room for subversion. in terms of not only the types of romances that exist, but also the expectations around what romance means, what relationships mean, what marriage means, and those kinds of things. And then on top of that, it's like you talked about family structures, which I think is a really good jumping off point to talk about what I would frame as like non-typical family structures, especially in fiction. You know, we've talked about found family, and I think found family is like this family structure that works so well. And as I've gotten older and gone through all my life experiences, it's like I have multiple found families. I have the found family that I developed when I was at university in Vancouver, my found family from Berlin, my found family in Ecuador, and they're just like people that you kind of like cling to and feel this like deep connection and companionship with, which is really beautiful. But then on top of that, it's like SFF provides so many opportunities for like outside the box kinds of thinking. Like if you're in sci-fi, it's like maybe there's like hive minds, or how do robots view family and familiar structure? How do aliens view family and relationships and all those things? So I wanted to ask you, like, why do you believe SFF is kind of like the perfect playground to break those rules? And why do you believe SFF readers connect so deeply with non-typical family structures?
Because we're all weirdos and we all just want to be understood. I say with great love and affection. But I think a lot of, so I think there's two kinds of schools of thought you can apply to science fiction and fantasy, which is that they explore possibility or they explore reality. By which I mean they explore the anxieties, the fears, and the hopes of the age, or they explore what we could accomplish. But I kind of think they're the same thing in a weird way. Some of them, so I think when we look at something like a lot of science fiction, and we look at the relationship dynamics that are depicted, and found family and science fiction seem to be very fast friends, right? They really go together. What we're saying is, if we walk away from the real world, what really matters to us, right? What do we really value when you take us away from Earth, or you put us on a spaceship, or you put us in an alternate future? What do we take with us? And I think the answer is that love in its many, many forms, familial, romantic, non-romantic, friendship, of course, actually in our real lives exists in a really weird range of forms. And when we put them into SFF, we can explore those more fully. So I think found family is such an interesting concept, because I think found family suggests that you look for them. And I think often you stumble into these families, right? You kind of, you find that you don't feel at home in your own one. And along the way, you meet people who you can't get away from, or you don't want to. And you end up with this bond with them that feels unbreakable. And I think that is actually, when you look at a lot of fiction, quite an odd thing, right? It doesn't seem like something we should expect or want or yearn for. And yet we search for it in SFF constantly. I think people love a found family because they want real emotional connections that matter.
It's like Friends, but because it's fantasy or sci-fi, it's more diverse and weirder.
Yes. I think I once heard someone describe our friendship group, someone in it described it as like an asexual polycule, and I was like, I get it. Like, yeah, I get it. And I was like, that's just friendship, my guy. That's what you call friends.
Just friendship.
Yeah. Oh my god. A polycule. I love how
that.
use that.
Asexual polycule.
Asexual polycule.
Yeah, and aromantic as well, funnily enough.
Yes.
Also
Beautiful.
just friendship. Amazing.
Yeah.
No, that is so beautiful though. I love that like description of that's gonna stick with me, that description of what we take with us when we pull ourselves out of the real world as readers, as writers, as creators. What are those touchstones that we keep coming back to? I really love that.
Yeah, it's like stepping out.
Also,
right.
But it's like you find the truest parts of yourselves when you step outside your comfort zone.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the first time you start making friends, actually, or finding mentors or building relationships outside of your family, is the first time you really get to understand who you are if you take yourself out of that context. And that's really interesting.
And then your parents are like, "You've changed." No.
Yes, I'm an adult now.
Like I have. It's not a phase, Mom.
What happened to my little baby boy?
Oh gosh, I adore that. All right. Well, to wind us down on this wonderful, wonderful chat about family and the complicated dynamics that it has in fiction and reality. Yeah, and incest. Can't forget incest.
How could we forget the incest?
How could we forget?
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget the most popular thing these days, evidently.
We're falling apart right at the end. Bring us home, MJ.
Were we together at any point? No, but do you have any final advice for authors looking to incorporate really dynamic family dynamics into their books?
I would say look in your old diaries and work out what really bothered you when you were about 13. That's the stuff you want to draw on.
Oh my God, I love that.
That's the meat. That's the meat of
That's the juicy stuff. It's better than therapy. So much cheaper. You might even make some money from it.
Oh my God. That's great. I need to look into some of my old shit.
I literally was thinking, I was like, I think that there is still a crate of my old diaries at my parents' house.
Oh my God.
Mine are at my parents' house. God, why do our parents have all of our good stuff?
I know. Why do they have all of our darkest secrets from when we were 12? See, that's the family dynamic.
Yeah.
We trust them.
They don't watch TV. They just read our diaries.
They just go through and read our old diaries.
Oh, and on that bombshell, that's it for this mini masterclass and our two-parter with Tasha. Thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's so fun.
So much fun. Tasha, where can folks find you online?
Nowhere after this, but but really, you can find me at tashasuri.com, and I'm on TikTok and Instagram as Tasha Suri as well. So feel free to come find me anywhere, and please don't talk to me about incest. That's all.
I'm just going to mute that word on all social media.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Go support Tasha's work, which doesn't include any incest, so I'm sorry. The Burning Kingdoms, which starts with the Jasmine Throne, Oleander Sword, and the Lotus Empire is out now. Go check out the Books of Amba duology if you want some remixology. I'm going to use that word again, of Wuthering Heights, or if you want some Doctor Who spin-off, go check those out as well. Tasha, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. And if you want to find SFF Addicts, you can check us out on Instagram, Threads, Twitter, all that jazz at sffaddictspod. You can find me at Adrian M. Gibson. If you want some weird fungal shit, then you can go check out Mushroom Blues. It's in hardcover and ebook. And I think at this point, it will be out very, very, very soon or out already in audiobook.
Ooh.
So go check that out as well. MJ, what about you?
Yep, you can find me across all the main socials at MJ Kuhn Books or just mjkuhn.com. Sign up for my newsletter, buy my books, do all the stuff. Okay.
Support the Thornton Food Fund. He needs an Erebor, so please support that beautiful little cat.
Oh yeah. Oh, we're not even gonna make him fat. We're gonna buy me a house now that's a mountain. Oh, okay. You need to buy a lot more books, guys.
Yeah. Or at the very least, fund a custom like cat house that looks like a mountain. Yeah.
Okay, I need this now.
Yeah.
I think you need to get a white cat that you name Smaug, frankly, but
yes.
you know.
And then a pile of gold, so you can just run full time.
There we go. All right. Halloween costumes for Thorin.
Let's do it.
In. I'll be Smaug.
Yeah. Get MJ a gold hoard, and everyone will be happy.
That's what we need.
Fucking off the rails. I love it. All right. Well, thank you all for listening. For now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.